Hello, everybody. Good morning or afternoon or whatever it is for you right now. We're moving into our next unit on this topic. By the way, the number's wrong there. It's 11.4, not 11.5. Mistakes happen. It's okay. This part is about Native Americans and Mexican Americans and some of the problems they faced. Um, remember, the Southerners ended up not using Native Americans as slaves, but they still faced a lot of problems during this time period, for sure. Um, so let's go ahead and start with westward expansion some more. Remember, what white settlers kept going further and further west. Various things made them want to go west: cheap land, the expansion of land needed for farming in the South, and other factors. But as they did this, they started to move on to land that had been promised to Native Americans as reservations. A reservation is a piece of land set aside for a Native American tribe or tribes or a nation of Native Americans. They were generally not fantastic pieces of land. Sorry, they were kind of shoved into places where white settlers didn't want to go a lot of the times. But as more and more land got taken up, that land seemed more and more attractive to the next group of settlers that came out. So white settlers would move on to Native American lands and try and find the best farmland they could there. Sometimes it was for gold or silver as well. Now, the reservations were set aside by treaty with the U.S. government. And as a part of this, someone that was called an Indian agent was assigned to oversee that area, basically be the connection between the government and the native tribe. And they were supposed to try and keep white people out of that territory, but they were in a really tough spot a lot of the time. Some of the time, these guys were corrupt, actually, and they basically took bribes to allow people to settle on Native American land illegally. Sometimes they were just honest guys trying to do their best to try and protect these Native Americans and their rights, but they were fighting an uphill battle for sure. But basically what would happen is too many white people would move into the reservation, the Native Americans and the white people would have conflicts, and then the U.S. government would come in again, make another treaty, and force the natives further west. That's what happened basically every time there was a problem like this. Native Americans had their problems. Mexican Americans also had problems. Remember, we just bought up a huge chunk of what used to be Mexico and made it into the United States. But as a part of that treaty, the citizens of Mexico that lived on that land actually became American citizens. Most of them were either ranchers or farmers, and some had gold or silver that they were prospecting on their land, but not too much. Most of it was farming and ranching for sure. Matter of fact, our idea of what a cowboy is came from these Mexican settlers. So anyway, the Americans basically came into this land and they kind of just started claiming things for their own. They basically thought, hey, we just won this war against Mexico, so the Mexican citizens don't have any rights, which wasn't legally true. But they basically would go in and try and claim as much land as they could from the Mexican people. And these people had been given these lands by the Mexican government. Sometimes, though, these lands weren't given with deeds or other proof. They were just kind of, the governor of an area might say, hey, this is your land now. Thanks for your service or whatever. And it was just known by everybody that land belonged to that person. But when white people come in and they're like, oh, hey, I want this land, and the Mexican settler there says, no, it's mine. Well, where's your proof? Right? So there's a lot of conflict between them. There was violence. There were people lying about things, white people coming in saying that they owned the land and they had proof of it, stuff like that. One big problem, though, like I mentioned, was that land ownership was a little bit different in the United States versus Mexico. Deeds were required for most forms of ownership in the United States. And like I said, Mexico was a little less strict on deeds. So that was a problem for a lot of Mexican families. And a lot of the wealthier families had the deeds. They had some kind of legal document saying that they were given that land by so-and-so. But the poorer ranchers generally didn't have a physical deed, and so they ended up losing some of their land. Another big difference between the two governments was how taxes were paid. Mexico used a system where you basically paid a percentage of what your land produced every year. So you would keep records of how many cattle you produced and how much you sold them for, and then you'd pay the Mexican government a part of that. which makes a lot of sense. Totally makes a lot of sense. The United States, on the other hand, they had something they called their real property tax, which basically means that you take a value of your land and you pay a percentage of that. This could create some problems because who values the land can be kind of tricky. Who determines how much that land is worth? How is it worth that much, right? Somebody has to figure that all out. But then also, what happens if there's a drought, right? And that land is normally worth a lot, but that year it didn't produce hardly anything. You still have to pay the same amount of taxes, even though you didn't make any money. So American farmers and ranchers were kind of used to that system. They budgeted for having to pay their taxes that way. The Mexican farmers, though, they're used to paying a percentage, right? So that's kind of what they're planning for, and it doesn't work out. So a lot of these Mexican farmers actually ended up losing their land over tax issues because they didn't understand the changes, or they weren't prepared for the changes, and so they didn't pay their taxes properly. And so they were forced off of their land through foreclosure or through the government taking over their land. So that's it for this chapter, actually. I'll be giving out a review next week, and we'll start that. Our test will be before the end of next week. So be prepared for that, and make sure you're taking notes, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Thanks.